Australia has seen its fair share of crime stories, robberies, gang wars, disappearances. But some of the most devastating crimes never involved a weapon at all. Instead, they were carried out with charm, paperwork, and a promise that sounded too good to resist. Across the last few decades, financial scams and corporate fraud have left scars on the country, just as deep as any violent crime. These weren't isolated incidents. They shook entire industries, wiped out life savings, and even triggered billion-dollar government bailouts. And perhaps the cruelest part, most of the victims weren't strangers duped by anonymous scammers online. They were family members, close friends, colleagues, even respected professionals, all manipulated by people they trusted. From the collapse of one of Australia's largest insurance companies to everyday investors who lost their homes to smooth-talking con artists, these cases reveal something chilling. When money and trust collide, the results can destroy lives on a massive scale. Regulators like ASIC and the ACCC have spent years tightening laws and chasing offenders, but history shows the scams only evolve, from fake slimming teas to Ponzi-style investment schemes to cryptocurrency fraud. The names and methods change, but the impact is always the same: shattered trust and financial ruin. In this video, we're diving into the world of Australia's biggest con artists, the high-profile fraudsters who exploited hope, greed, and trust. Their stories aren't just about stolen money. They're about betrayal, power, and how fragile financial security can really be. So before we get started, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing the community from all around the world. And don't forget, subscribe for more true crime documentaries that dig into the cases shaping how we think about trust, money, and crime. Melissa Caddick, New South Wales, the disappearing financial advisor. At 6:45 a.m. on November 11, 2020, the peace of a quiet Dover Heights street was broken. Officers from the Australian Federal Police, AFP, and investigators from the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, converged on a sleek cliffside mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Their target was Melissa Louise Caddick, a 49-year-old financial advisor who for years had presented herself as the very image of success. That morning, ASIC carried with it orders from the Federal Court of Australia. The suspicion was damning. Caddick and her company, Melissa Proprietary Limited, had been operating without the legally required Australian Financial Services AFS license since at least June 2013. Investigators moved room by room, seizing documents, laptops, hard drives, and even designer items. They were assembling evidence of what they believed to be one of the most extensive financial deceptions in Australian history. No one could have predicted that within 24 hours of the raid, Melissa Caddick would vanish without a trace. On the morning of November 12, 2020, Melissa's teenage son told police he heard the front door close early. His mother had apparently left the house wearing only running clothes and sneakers. She carried no phone, no wallet, no keys. She never returned. Her husband, DJ Anthony Coletti, later told investigators he assumed she had gone out for exercise. But when the hours passed with no sign of her, the reality became clear. Melissa was missing. The timing was extraordinary. Just one day after federal agents raided her home and seized evidence, the woman at the center of a suspected $20 to $30 million fraud had disappeared. Melissa Caddick was born in 1971 in Sydney. Friends described her as ambitious, determined, and socially polished. She attended private schools and studied secretariats, a work before moving into financial services. Her early career was promising but turbulent. In 2009, while working at NRMA's financial services arm, she was sanctioned by ASIC for breaching a conflict of interest rule and was banned from working as a financial advisor for several years. Rather than stepping back, she reinvented herself. By 2012, she had registered Melissa Proprietary Limited, presenting it as a boutique financial services business catering to high-net-worth clients. On paper, Melissa looked legitimate. In reality, ASIC would later confirm that neither Melissa nor her company ever held an AFS license. This meant every piece of advice she gave, Every financial product she offered was not only misleading, it was illegal. Between 2013 and 2020, Caddick perfected her scheme. She convinced clients, many of them family, friends, or longtime acquaintances, that she was investing their money in blue-chip shares through CommSec, Australia's largest retail stockbroker. She fabricated CommSec portfolio statements, forging documents that showed strong returns and growth. In reality, not a cent was invested. Instead, Melissa diverted the money directly into her own accounts. She lived a lifestyle designed to reinforce the illusion of success. A $6.2 million mansion in Dover Heights, luxury cars, designer jewelry and couture, overseas holidays. Victims would later describe how persuasive she was. One told the Sydney Morning Herald, "She was someone we trusted with everything. We never thought to question her. She was family." According to court-appointed liquidators, at least 72 investors were defrauded, losing between $20 million and $30 million. Many had handed over their retirement savings or inheritances. In the weeks before her disappearance, ASIC had already filed civil proceedings. The federal court froze her bank accounts and restrained her from leaving the country. After she went missing, the court ordered Maliviptai Limited wound up. Jones' partners, the receivers, were tasked with recovering what they could. The findings were grim. Most of the stolen funds had been spent. Only a fraction could be clawed back from the sale of her mansion, her luxury items, and artwork. Victims were told they would see only limited compensation. For ASIC, the case was a textbook example of why licensing exists. An AFS license requires adherence to regulatory standards and external oversight. Melissa had sidestepped both, leaving no protections for her clients. For months, police searched coastal cliffs, bushland, and waterways near Dover Heights. No trace of Melissa emerged. Then, on February 21, 2021, nearly 400 kilometers south of Sydney, a grim discovery was made. On Bournda Beach, near the town of Tathra, a jogger spotted a blue running shoe washed ashore. Inside were decomposed human remains. DNA testing confirmed what many had feared. The remains were Melissa Caddick's. The discovery stunned the country, but rather than providing closure, it only deepened the mystery. The case was referred to the New South Wales State Coroner. Over the next 2 years, evidence was examined. Financial records, CCTV, testimony from her husband and victims. On May 25, 2023, Deputy State Coroner Elizabeth Ryan handed down her findings. She ruled that Melissa Caddick was deceased, but she declared that the manner, time, and cause of death could not be determined. There was no evidence to prove whether Melissa had taken her own life, fallen accidentally from a cliff, or met with foul play. Ryan noted that Melissa's financial misconduct was clear and devastating. She had engaged in conduct that was dishonest, unethical, and illegal. But as for her final moments, the mystery remained. For Melissa's investors, the inquest brought little comfort. Many had lost everything. Some were forced out of retirement, others had to sell homes. One victim told ABC News, "It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. We trusted her completely. She took advantage of that." The damage was not only financial, but emotional, fracturing families and friendships. Even after her death was confirmed, many victims said they felt robbed of justice. Melissa Caddick's downfall is both a financial scandal and a mystery. A glamorous advisor who lived beyond her means, she left behind devastated families, unanswered questions, and a trail of financial destruction. Her story underscores a critical truth. Under Australian law, anyone providing financial advice must hold an AFS license. That license is not a bureaucratic hurdle. It is a safeguard designed to protect investors. Melissa's victims never checked. Many later admitted they didn't even know what an AFS license was. The Caddick case has since been used by ASIC in campaigns warning Australians, always verify your advisor's credentials. Melissa Caddick's story ends not with a conviction or a confession, but with a single running shoe on a beach. The coroner has declared her dead, but the most haunting question remains unanswered. Did she fall? Did she jump? Or did someone push her? Hamish McLaren, New South Wales, the Playboy Conman. On a cool winter's day in June 2017, the streets of Bondi Beach were busy with surfers, tourists, and locals soaking up the coastal buzz. Among the crowd was a man who seemed to fit in seamlessly, tall, well-dressed, confident. To strangers, he looked like another wealthy financier enjoying Sydney's eastern suburbs. But to police closing in on him, this was no ordinary man. His name was Hamish Earl McLaren, also known as Hamish Maxwell, and behind the tailored suits and the stories of hedge funds and foreign investments, he was hiding a trail of devastation worth millions. That day, McLaren was arrested. It was the moment the carefully crafted persona of a jet-setting millionaire collapsed, and the beginning of one of Australia's most infamous fraud cases. McLaren had built a reputation on charm. To those who met him, he seemed knowledgeable, worldly, and connected. He promised access to lucrative opportunities, currency trading, gold markets, and international equities. He spoke with authority, dropping the names of major banks and fund managers. Between 2011 and 2017, McLaren convinced at least 15 victims to hand over their savings, life insurance payouts, inheritances, and business funds. According to court filings, the total loss was $7.66 million. But in reality, there were no investments. Not a dollar was placed in stocks or currencies. McLaren simply shuffled money between accounts, paying out small returns to build confidence while funding his own lifestyle, luxury travel, expensive cars, and an image of wealth that kept the illusion alive. His victims came from all walks of life: professionals, business owners, retirees, and even celebrities. Among the most high-profile was fashion designer Lisa Ho, once one of Australia's most recognizable names in fashion. Ho had known McLaren through personal circle, and, like others, was drawn in by his convincing talk of safe, high-yield investments. Court documents later revealed she lost a substantial portion of her retirement savings. For someone who had built a fashion empire only to see it collapse, the financial hit was crushing. Other victims told ABC News and the Sydney Morning Herald similar stories. Some handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars. One victim said, "He was so believable. He knew everything about markets. He had the answers to every question. You couldn't help but trust him." The betrayal was not just financial. It was deeply personal. McLaren often befriended his victims, attending their dinners, meeting their families, and embedding himself into their lives before taking their money. What made McLaren so effective was not just the promise of financial returns, but the way he engineered trust. Experts later described his technique as affinity fraud, a type of scam where the fraudster exploits relationships, personal networks, or shared identities to manipulate victims. He studied his targets, learning what motivated them. For some, it was securing retirement. For others, building wealth for children. He mirrored their values, made them feel understood, and then positioned himself as the solution. In court, prosecutors revealed how McLaren produced professional-looking spreadsheets and statements to back up his claims. He knew enough financial jargon to appear credible, but always kept the details vague enough to avoid scrutiny. By 2017, the walls began to close in. Several victims became suspicious when withdrawals were delayed or excuses piled up. Some began comparing stories and realized they were being told the same lies. In June 2017, detectives from New South Wales police finally moved in. McLaren was arrested at Bondi and charged with a string of offenses. 2 years later, in June 2019, McLaren stood before the Sydney District Court. He pleaded guilty to 18 fraud charges. The sentencing hearing laid bare the scale of the deception. The court heard how McLaren had shown no regard for the financial and emotional devastation he left behind. Judge Colin Charteris described his conduct as reprehensible, noting that the fraud was sustained, deliberate, and targeted at people who trusted him. The losses were staggering: Over $7.6 million across 15 victims. For some, it meant the loss of retirement security. For others, the collapse of businesses or family finances. The court also heard about the psychological impact. Victims spoke of sleepless nights, broken relationships, and enduring anxiety. One victim said, "It wasn't just money. He destroyed my ability to trust anyone." McLaren was sentenced to a maximum of 16 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 12 years. McLaren later appealed the severity of his sentence to the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal. While the court agreed to a slight reduction, the result still left him facing well over a decade behind bars. The conviction stood, and the judgment reinforced the seriousness of white-collar crime in Australia. As McLaren sat in prison, his story took on a life of its own. In 2019, the popular investigative podcast, Who the Hell is Hamish?, produced by The Australian, traced his career of deception, interviewing victims and piecing together how he operated across multiple countries. The podcast revealed that McLaren's scam stretched beyond Australia, with alleged victims in Hong Kong, the United States, and Canada. The portrait that emerged was not just of a fraudster, but of a man who thrived on the thrill of deception, crafting new identities whenever old ones collapsed. The podcast turned him into a household name, ensuring that his crimes and his victims' voices would not be forgotten. For the victims, the sentences and the podcast brought little relief. Many never recovered their money. Liquidators traced what remained of his assets, but the funds were gone, spent on sustaining the illusion of wealth. For law enforcement and regulators, the case became a stark reminder of the power of affinity fraud and the dangers of trusting without verifying. Unlike corporate frauds carried out through institutions, McLaren's crimes were deeply personal, built on face-to-face trust. Hamish McLaren's story is a cautionary tale about the danger of believing promises that sound too good to be true. His victims were not naive. They were successful professionals, business owners, and retirees. What they shared was trust in a man who appeared credible, sophisticated, and caring. The key lesson, reinforced by ASIC and the courts, is this: always verify licenses and credentials. Never rely on personality or appearances alone. Be suspicious of guaranteed returns in volatile markets like foreign exchange or gold. As Judge Charteris put it during sentencing, McLaren's conduct was not a momentary lapse. It was a calculated betrayal sustained over 6 years. For years, he had lived as the Playboy Conman, weaving stories of wealth and opportunity while quietly destroying lives. Today, he remains in prison, serving one of the longest sentences for fraud in Australian history. Peter Foster, Queensland, the serial scammer. On the morning of August 20, 2020, in far north Queensland, police closed in on a man walking barefoot along the sand. The figure was familiar to investigators across multiple countries. He was Peter Clarence Foster, a 57-year-old who had spent more than 3 decades in and out of courts and prisons for fraud. This time, Foster was accused of masterminding a scheme to defraud a Hong Kong pilot of nearly $2 million worth of Bitcoin, linked to an alleged sports betting investment. He denied the allegations. Yet for Australians, the arrest was no surprise. For most of his adult life, Peter Foster has been synonymous with scams: slimming products, miracle cures, fraudulent franchises, and sports betting cons. To many, his 2020 arrest was simply the latest chapter in a career of deception that began in the 1980s. Peter Foster first became notorious in the mid-1980s. His name was tied to a string of weight loss tea and health product scams that gained attention not only in Australia, but internationally. He marketed slimming teas and miracle health products that promised rapid weight loss, often endorsed by celebrities. Investigations later revealed these products were misleading and often backed by false claims. Regulators across Australia and the UK began to track him, and lawsuits followed. By the 1990s, Foster had become a household name in Australia, often dubbed a con man in media headlines. He cultivated notoriety and seemed to thrive on it. Foster's scams evolved with the times. In the early 2000s, he moved into promoting fraudulent investment and health products, His methods followed a pattern: create a company, launch a revolutionary product or scheme, recruit investors with promises of extraordinary returns, then walk away when regulators moved in. It was during this period that he became associated with the SensaSlim case, one of the most infamous consumer fraud cases in Australian history. In 2005-2006, Foster was linked to SensaSlim, a company that marketed a weight loss spray said to suppress appetite and cause rapid weight loss. SensaSlim claimed it was backed by a worldwide network of scientific research. In reality, the scientific study SensaSlim boasted about was fabricated. Regulators quickly realized the operation was misleading consumers and franchisees. By the early 2010s, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC, had launched a federal court case. In 2013, the federal court jailed Peter Foster for 3 years, with 18 months to serve, for contempt of court. The court found he had breached previous orders banning him from promoting or engaging in the weight loss industry. The conviction highlighted his willingness to ignore restrictions. Despite court bans, Foster simply shifted his schemes into new guises, using associates or false names to continue operations. In 2014, the federal court officially found that SensaSlim had engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct. The ACCC pursued penalties against both the company and Foster. By 2016, the rulings were clear. SensaSlim was ordered to pay $355 million in penalties. Peter Foster was fined $660,000 personally. He was given lifetime bans from participating in the weight loss and franchise industries. He was also disqualified from managing corporations. The ACCC issued statements at the time warning consumers and franchise operators to be wary of schemes promising dramatic results. The case was a landmark in Australian consumer law, showing regulators were willing to pursue multi-million-dollar penalties against fraudulent health products. Despite repeated convictions, fines, and bans, Foster's career shows a consistent pattern: create a new scam, exploit loopholes, and reinvent himself after each collapse. From slimming teas in the 1980s to the SensaSlim spray in the 2000s, and later online betting, his schemes always played on the same human desire, the hope for quick, easy solutions, whether for health or wealth. Then came the 2020 arrest. Police alleged that Foster had reinvented himself yet again, this time in the world of cryptocurrency and online betting. According to ABC News and The Guardian, Foster was accused of defrauding a Hong Kong pilot of nearly $2 million worth of Bitcoin. The alleged scam involved a sports betting operation that promised high returns on digital currency investments. When Foster was arrested on a beach in Queensland, barefoot and unassuming, he denied the charges. He was extradited to New South Wales and charged with fraud-related offences. Court proceedings have continued, with Foster maintaining his innocence. As of the latest verified updates, the matter remains before the courts. No final judgment has been made. Peter Foster's name is not only infamous in Australia. Over the years, he has faced scrutiny in the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Pacific Islands. Wherever he has gone, stories of questionable investments and fraudulent products have followed. In the UK during the 1990s, he was linked to similar slimming product scams. In Fiji and Vanuatu, he was accused of operating fraudulent schemes, often slipping out of jurisdictions before charges could fully take hold. His global trail has added to his reputation as one of the most persistent fraudsters of his generation. While court cases focus on dollars lost and penalties imposed, the human cost of Foster's scams has been devastating. Franchisees of SensaSlim told media they lost their life savings after buying into the company, believing in the fraudulent research it promoted. Consumers who trusted his products often wasted money on useless treatments. The Hong Kong pilot at the center of the 2020 case reportedly lost nearly $2 million, a sum that underscores how Foster's schemes adapted to modern finance, shifting from miracle sprays to Bitcoin. The ACCC has consistently pointed to Foster's cases as reminders of the need for vigilance. In public statements after the SensaSlim ruling, The Commission stressed the importance of scrutinizing extraordinary claims and demanding verifiable scientific or financial evidence. ASIC and the ACCC have both used Foster's record to highlight how serial offenders adapt to new markets, requiring regulators to evolve their enforcement strategies as scams move online and cross borders. What makes Peter Foster's story compelling is not just the variety of his scams, but their consistency. The products may change: tea, sprays, franchises, sports betting, cryptocurrency, but the strategy remains the same. Promise life-changing results, dazzle investors with confident talk, and vanish with the money. His ability to reinvent himself, despite court orders, multi-million-dollar fines, and prison sentences, has made him a symbol of the dangers of unchecked trust in too-good-to-be-true opportunities. As of now, his latest case remains unresolved, and he maintains his innocence. Yet, whatever the outcome, his legacy as one of Australia's most notorious serial scammers is already cemented. Jody Harris, New South Wales and Victoria. Catch me if you can, conwoman. In 2006, a young woman in her 20s walked confidently through the corridors of a Sydney hospital. She wore the bearing of a professional, spoke with the authority of a trained medical worker, and assured those around her that she was there to help. She was not a doctor at all. She was Jodie Pearson Harding, better known as Jody Harris, a woman who had built her life on deception. By the time she was exposed, Harris had already left behind a trail of stolen identities, drained bank accounts, and shattered trust. Her scams were audacious not only for their scale, but for their theatricality. She did not hide in the shadows of the internet or rely on complex financial systems. Instead, she walked boldly into lives, hotels, and workplaces, posing as doctors, lawyers, or police officers, roles that carry instant credibility, and exploited that trust to strip her victims of their financial security. Between 2005 and 2006, Harris carried out more than 100 identity fraud offences across New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. According to court records, her schemes netted her about $175,000 in less than a year. Her method was both simple and effective. She would obtain personal details through stolen mail, observation, or manipulation, and then assume her victims' identities. Armed with new names, she would open accounts, withdraw cash, and take control of credit cards. She didn't stop at impersonating everyday citizens. Harris donned disguises of authority, pretending to be a doctor, a lawyer, even a police officer. These personas opened doors that ordinary fraud would not. They allowed her access to places and people who would never have suspected the young woman standing before them was in fact a serial fraudster. She used stolen identities to check into luxury hotels, eat at fine restaurants, and shop for designer clothing and jewelry. Witnesses recalled her charm. She could pass herself off as confident and educated, someone to be respected. The confidence trick was her art. By mid-2006, her luck ran out. Police, already tracking a string of fraudulent withdrawals and identity theft complaints, linked them back to Harris. She was arrested and charged with more than 100 counts of fraud and identity theft. In September 2006, she faced sentencing in a New South Wales court. The judge condemned her pattern of deception as both reckless and damaging. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison with eligibility for parole in January 2010. For many victims, the conviction brought little solace. Beyond the stolen money, savings accounts, credit lines, and personal funds, there was the emotional damage of knowing a stranger had so easily taken over their lives. Some victims endured years of trying to rebuild their credit histories and prove who they really were. If the 2006 conviction had marked the end of her fraud career, Jody Harris might have faded into history as just another identity thief. But 2 years later, her name was back in the courts. In 2008, Harris pleaded guilty in Victoria to a staggering 96 additional charges of fraud, theft, and identity offenses. These crimes involved about $160,000 in stolen funds and assets. The Victorian judge noted her repeat offending and the deliberate, calculated way she manipulated victims. She was sentenced to 2 more years in prison added to her existing time. By then, the media had branded her Australia's Catch Me If You Can conwoman, drawing comparisons to Frank Abagnale, the American imposter who famously posed as a pilot and doctor. But unlike Abagnale, whose story was later glamorized, Harris's victims were ordinary people who lost real money and years of peace of mind. After serving her time, Harris emerged under a different name, Jody Thompson. For a while she appeared to live quietly, but in recent years she resurfaced in a very different role, that of a charity worker. Thompson became the face of Dreamtime Aroha, an organization she promoted as dedicated to Indigenous empowerment and cultural projects. She presented herself as a passionate advocate, appearing in community events and online, often in high-profile circles. At first glance, it seemed like redemption. A woman who had once deceived dozens was now trying to give back. But soon, questions began to mount. Investigations by The Australian and reports on ABC News uncovered serious concerns about Dreamtime Aroha's operations. Critics alleged that the charity lacked transparency over its finances and had failed to deliver on promised projects. There were also claims that content and materials used in Dreamtime Aroha campaigns had been plagiarized from other Indigenous organizations. Some donors and supporters questioned where their money was going. Queensland's Office of Fair Trading reportedly examined aspects of the organization, though Harris, now Thompson, continued to deny any wrongdoing. She has not been convicted of fraud in connection with her charitable work, but the controversy reignited memories of her past. For many it raised the question, had she truly reformed, or was this just another carefully constructed persona? Media coverage of Harris's reinvention has been polarized. Supporters point to her apparent commitment to community projects, suggesting she deserves a second chance after serving her time. Detractors argue that her history of deception undermines her credibility, and that victims of identity fraud live with the consequences long after a perpetrator's sentence is finished. For Harris, her story remains haunted by the moniker given to her, Catch Me If You Can conwoman. Even as Jody Thompson, the past shadows every step. Identity fraud is often seen as a financial crime, measured in stolen sums and fraudulent charges, but Harris's case shows the deeper toll. Victims described feeling violated, stripped not only of money, but of their sense of safety. Some spent years repairing damaged credit scores, fighting to convince banks and government agencies that they were not the ones who had opened fraudulent accounts. One victim told reporters, "It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing someone was out there, pretending to be me. That's a feeling you can't shake." This is the true cost of Harris's crimes, a lingering erosion of trust. From impersonating doctors and police officers to checking into luxury hotels under stolen names, Jodie Harris built a life of lies that crumbled under the weight of court convictions. Her 2006 four-year sentence and 2008 two-year addition reflected the seriousness of her offenses, yet her story didn't end there. Today, under the name Jody Thompson, she presents herself as a charity leader. But investigations and scrutiny suggest her credibility remains under question. It leaves scars not easily repaired, creating suspicion and mistrust that lingers long after court cases close. Jody Harris may have tried to reinvent herself, but her past, like the hundreds of names she once stole, remains part of her identity. Rodney Adler, New South Wales. The HIH Insurance collapse. In March 2001, the financial world of Australia was rocked by a corporate implosion of unprecedented scale. HIH Insurance, once the country's second-largest insurer, collapsed under the weight of mismanagement, reckless investments, and deceit. The consequences were staggering. Losses were estimated at $5.3 billion, forcing the federal government to step in with a massive bailout to cover policyholders. Thousands of ordinary Australians, families, businesses, and community groups were left exposed when their insurer failed. It remains one of the largest corporate collapses in Australian history. At the center of the storm was Rodney Stephen Adler, a high-profile businessman and company director whose actions contributed directly to the downfall. By 2005, Adler would stand in court, plead guilty to multiple offenses, and become one of the few high-flying executives in Australia to be jailed for white-collar crime. HIH began as a modest insurer in the 1960s but grew aggressively in the 1990s under CEO Ray Williams. The company pursued rapid expansion, acquiring other insurers domestically and overseas. Its most notorious acquisition was the takeover of UK-based World Marine General Insurance in 1997 and later the disastrous purchase of FAI Insurance. This expansion was fueled by risky strategies. HIH underpriced insurance policies to gain market share and took on high-risk investments without proper reserves. Analysts later described the company's balance sheets as dangerously overstated, painting a far rosier picture of solvency than reality. By the late 1990s, concerns about HIH's financial health were mounting. Still, directors and executives continued to reassure shareholders and the market that the company was sound. Rodney Adler, born in 1959, was not just any director. He was the son of Larry Adler, founder of the successful insurance company FAI. When HIH acquired FAI in 1998, Rodney Adler joined HIH's board as a director. Known for his flamboyant style and outspoken views, Adler became a public face of HIH. But behind the image, regulators later discovered that Adler had misled investors and abused his role as a company director. After HIH's collapse, the federal government established a royal commission in 2001, led by Justice Neville Owen. The inquiry examined what had gone wrong and who was responsible. The commission's findings were damning. HIH had engaged in poor corporate governance, inadequate risk management, and misleading financial reporting. It identified failings across the board, from directors to auditors to regulators. Rodney Adler's conduct was singled out. He was accused of disseminating false information to the market and being intentionally dishonest in his duties as a director. In 2005, Adler pleaded guilty to 4 criminal charges: disseminating false information to the market, obtaining money by false or misleading statements, 2 counts of being intentionally dishonest as a director of HIH. These charges related to Adler encouraging investments in HIH at a time when he knew the company was in deep financial distress. He misled shareholders, propping up the illusion of stability while HIH was teetering on collapse. On April 14, 2005, Adler was sentenced in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Justice Reginald Barrett handed down a 4.5-year prison sentence with a non-parole period of 2.5 years. Justice Barrett described Adler's conduct as a gross breach of trust, noting that directors carry a responsibility not just to shareholders, but to the wider market and community that depend on corporate integrity. The sentencing was historic. In Australia, it was rare for company directors of major firms to face significant jail time for misconduct. Adler's punishment sent a strong message about the seriousness of corporate fraud. In addition to imprisonment, Adler was disqualified from managing corporations for 20 years, effectively ending his career in company leadership. The punishment reflected the scale of harm caused by HIH's collapse and Adler's role in misleading investors. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, welcomed the ruling. In a public statement, ASIC said the sentence demonstrated that corporate misconduct would not be tolerated and that directors had to be held accountable for the integrity of financial markets. HIH's collapse devastated ordinary Australians. Policyholders found their insurance worthless. Employees lost jobs. Shareholders lost their investments. The government's $5.3 billion bailout was necessary to protect policyholders, but came at the expense of taxpayers. The Royal Commission highlighted systemic issues: poor regulation, lack of transparency, and weak governance standards. The collapse became a catalyst for major reforms in corporate law and financial oversight in Australia. Adler served about 2.5 years of his sentence before being released in October 2007. His time in custody made headlines, as did his attempts to return to business life after release. While he sought new ventures, his 20-year ban from managing corporations restricted his opportunities. The stigma of the HIH collapse followed him. Though legally free, Adler's name remained synonymous with corporate failure and deceit. The Adler case has since become a cornerstone example in law schools, business ethics courses, and financial regulation discussions. It demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of director dishonesty and weak governance. The collapse of HIH and Adler's conviction reinforced several key lessons. Directors must act honestly and in the best interests of the company. Misleading the market undermines not only shareholders, but public trust in financial systems. Regulators and auditors must exercise vigilance to detect signs of financial manipulation. HIH's failure spurred reforms, including tighter disclosure requirements and increased powers for ASIC. Beyond numbers and court rulings, the collapse destroyed lives. Shareholders, many of them retirees, lost their savings. Policyholders were left exposed, some unable to claim insurance when they needed it most. Employees faced unemployment overnight. For victims, Adler's prison sentence was symbolic justice, but it could not repair the financial devastation. Rodney Adler's story is one of hubris, deception, and downfall. Once a high-flying director with influence and wealth, his choices contributed to one of Australia's largest corporate failures. His guilty pleas and prison term marked a rare moment of accountability in the world of white-collar crime. The HIH collapse remains a reminder of the fragility of trust in corporate governance. Billions were lost, thousands of lives disrupted, and confidence in the system deeply shaken. Adler's name endures in Australian corporate history, not for the empire he inherited, but for the collapse that followed, and for the warning his case provides. Financial crime doesn't always make the front page in the same way as a robbery or a violent act, but its impact in Australia has been devastating. The collapse of HIH Insurance alone cost taxpayers billions. Melissa Caddick's betrayal left families without life savings. Hamish McLaren's victims lost their futures to promises of easy returns. Peter Foster showed how scams can morph from slimming tea to cryptocurrency, always one step ahead of regulators. And Jody Harris proved that even something as personal as your identity can be stolen and weaponized. For the public, these cases left more than financial scars. They created deep distrust of advisors, of companies, even of charities. Ordinary people, who thought they were making smart, safe choices, were left questioning how secure their financial world really is. For the law, each case forced change. The HIH collapse led to tougher corporate governance rules and sharper powers for ASIC. The exposure of affinity frauds pushed regulators to launch campaigns urging Australians to always check for an AFS license. And ongoing controversies remind us that enforcement is never finished. As scams evolve, the law has to evolve with them. These stories show us that fraud isn't just about money, it's about broken trust. And in many ways, rebuilding that trust takes longer than repaying any dollar figure. So what do you think about these cases? Which one shocked you the most and why? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more true crime documentaries where we go beyond the headlines and look at the crimes that shaped not just individuals, but an entire nation.